I hope you all picked up a handout at the door. And if you have a chance, didn't have a chance to look at the picture on the way in, there is a wonderful picture of one of the first two Sikh gentlemen to ever be permitted to attend and graduate from West Point, because the fact that their religion calls for not cutting the hair, whereas cadets normally cannot have any facial hair, and wearing a turban instead of the traditional cap has until now been a non-starter. However, the Army, after several years of deliberations, figured out how they could move beyond this, and fortunately for our class, the first graduates were in May. So on your way out, stop and take a picture of that. Being good Presbyterians, let us begin with a moment of prayer. Loving God, you fill all things with a fullness and hope that we can never comprehend. We pray that you will take away our natural temptation for cynicism, denial, fear, and despair. Help us to have the courage to awaken to greater truth, greater humility, and greater care for one another. May we place our hope in what matters and what lasts, trusting in your eternal presence and love, knowing, good God, that you are hearing us better than we are speaking. We offer these prayers in all the holy names of God. Amen. First, a word about the unusual genres of this book. It is at once both a memoir about the remarkable life of a brown Sikh woman and a manifesto, a public declaration of aims and goals for learning how to live a life guided by revolutionary love. Both aims of the book, to tell Valerie Cower's own story and to motivate us to join her in revolutionary love, are intertwined throughout this remarkable work. As we follow her life experiences, we see both the ways in which people who, because of their race or ethnicity, live lives very different from those of us who are white, and the incidents which led her to conclude that love is the only true redeeming force in the world, and how we can learn to practice that love in our daily lives, following Jesus' commandment that we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. She is not talking about love as a warm and fuzzy feeling or a flood of emotion, but as the animating force that holds us together. Cower says, love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving, a choice we make over and over again. Love as sweet labor can be modeled, taught, and practiced. This labor engages all of our emotions. Joy, she says, is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger protects that which is loved. And when we think we have reached our limit, wonder is the act that returns us to love. She opens her book with this dedication, quote, "This book is for anyone who feels breathless. Maybe you are holding someone close who is struggling and suffering. Maybe you are reeling from the latest mass shooting, or the refugee crisis at the border, or the looming threat of climate change, or the blistering pace of a global pandemic. Maybe like me, you're breathless from all the above. I thought my breathlessness was a sign of weakness until a friend told me what I wish to tell you. Your breathlessness is a sign of your bravery. It means you are awake to what's happening now. The world is in transition. End quote. I too believe that we are, if not in transition, then at an inflection point in American history, where the choices that we make as a society about dealing with white supremacy, climate change, systemic racial injustice, immigration, and the related question of who America really belongs to, our deeply fractured civil society will either create a new version of America, closer to what our ideals have long proclaimed, but we have never yet fully realized, or continue to degenerate into an undeclared or more horribly possible actual civil war and the loss of our democracy. The choices we face now are truly momentous. I think most of us would like to live in a better world, one that more closely resembles Isaiah's vision of the peaceable kingdom. But we don't know how to make that happen. Cower has some practical suggestions for how we can make that reality actual. And that is what, to me and to several others who have read this book, is so very, very exciting about it. Her book unfolds in 3 parts. The first part is about learning to love others. When we wonder about people, grieve with them, and choose to fight with and for them, we can build the kind of solidarity the world needs. Part 2, Tend the Wound, is about learning how to love even our opponents. When we rage in safe containers to bind our own wounds and listen to understand their wounds, we can gain the information we need to begin to reimagine how things could be. Part 3, Breathe and Push, using the metaphor of birthing labor, is about learning to love ourselves, how to breathe amidst labor, push ourselves to go deeper, and summon our wisest selves in times of transition. This morning, we're going to focus on part 1, loving others. Cower's grandfather emigrated from India in the early 1900s and bought a small farm in the Central Valley of California to continue his life as a farmer. Cower's parents emigrated to the U.S. and moved in with his family after the partition of what is now Pakistan from India in 1947. By the time of Cower's parents' move, there were other Sikhs living in this part of the Central California Valley. Sikhism is a monotheistic religion which originated in the Punjab region of India in the 1400s. Its founder, Nanak, was deeply troubled by the constant violence between Hindus and Muslims. He disappeared for 3 days, but returned after a mystical vision of the oneness of all humanity and indeed the world. This created in him a state of ecstatic wonder in which everyone around him was simply a part of him he did not yet know. He called on his followers to practice equality, service to others, and social justice. Sikhs became known as warriors, sworn to defend all people, not just Sikhs, in harm's way, which is why men not only wear turbans to make them appear taller and therefore easier to spot when you are the person who needs some help, and they wear a small ceremonial dagger representing this warrior commitment bound into their turbans. What a powerful idea Guru Nanak taught. I see no stranger. I see no enemy. I see only a part of myself I do not yet know. This idea is echoed in religions around the world. The Buddha called people to practice unending compassion. Abraham to open our tent to all, and there sometimes thereby to entertain angels unaware. Muhammad to take in the orphan, and of course Jesus to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. They speak of a common vision of our interconnectedness and interdependence. What has been ancient spiritual truth is increasingly verified by science. Population genetics now prove that we share one common ancestry with everyone. The 7 daughters of Eve. Geneticists show how all humans now living are descended from one ancient Eve, because we all, every one of us in this world, bears an identical DNA sequence in the mitochondria, the energy-producing part of every human cell. Think for a moment about a chicken egg and compare it to a human egg. The yolk of an egg, which you may have had for breakfast this morning, is like the nucleus of the human egg, and the egg white it's called cytoplasm when it's in a human cell. A human sperm is just a bundle of DNA with a tail for swimming. When a human egg is fertilized, all of that DNA is contained within what would be the yolk of a chicken egg, whereas the mitochondria are all in the egg white. So all of the genetic information in the mitochondria comes down entirely through the maternal line of human females. Geneticists use this maternal trail to trace the migration of groups of women around the world. There was more than one ancient Eve, of course, but if a woman never has any daughters, her line dies out when she dies. The fact that all humans tested so far have a common sequence proves that no matter how different we look, we are all distantly related to this one ancient Eve. The air we breathe contains atoms that passed through the lungs of our ancestors now dead. The atoms in our body at one time were part of distant stars. We can look upon the face of anyone around us and say, as a moral declaration, and a spiritual and cosmological and biological fact. You are a part of me I do not yet know. And wonder is what urges us to get to know these strangers who literally are a part of us. If wonder is where love begins, then the failure to wonder is the beginning of violence. When people do not see other people as a part of them, they disable their instinct for empathy, allowing them to do evil things to, or to allow others to abuse other people. We certainly see this in our deeply fractured civil society, where our long-held ideals of tolerance and equality, never fully practiced, but still the ideals on which America was founded, have led us to treat citizens with different political ideas as enemies, leading not only to verbal but physical violence against one another. Cower's introduction to lack of empathy began when she was 6 and called a black dog and pushed to the ground by an older white boy at school. She recalls thinking, "I had never seen myself through your eyes before," and was for the first time ashamed of her brown skin. In the 8th grade, her best friend, a white girl, discovered that Sikhism was not a small Christian sect, but in fact, a non-Christian religion, and told Cower that her pastor had told her that they could not be friends anymore because Cower was going to burn in hell forever, and their friendship ended. Seeing no stranger is an act of will. Our minds are primed to see the world in terms of us and them. PET scans, which are a kind of scanning mechanism which allows us to watch the brain actually functioning, shows that we decide in an instant, just in milliseconds, long before conscious thought, whether the image of a human face shown to us is an us or a them. But we can choose to see the face of another as a person. In studies done of people looking at the images of persons of differing races, when shown pictures long enough for conscious comprehension of the image, it is possible to dampen the unconscious fear of the other. It can be as simple as wondering what that person might like to eat for dinner. And all of us can do that. It can be as simple as whenever we come across a face on the street or even on a screen, to say in our minds, sister, brother, sibling, aunt, uncle. This trains our minds to see a greater variety of people as a part of our us, as beings worthy of our care and consideration. Jesus' ministry is full of stories about him violating the many taboos of the Jewish purity codes by mingling with the officially designated outcasts, lepers, women, healing the sick, and on the Sabbath even, sharing dinner with the despised tax collectors, and many more. Stories that divide the world into an us and a them have a singular power to disconnect us from others. Time and again, we have witnessed that when one group of people decide to abuse some other group for whatever reason, their first tactic is to start by dehumanizing their opponents in preparation for subsequent abuse. So-called enemies become filthy mongrel dogs, for example, which then explains, of course, why they need to be exterminated. That's what we do with rabid dogs. Stories that expand the collective, however, have the power to return us to one another. Coward tells the story of deciding one Sunday to go and confront her former friend's pastor. She tried knocking on the first church door that she came to, but found it locked. And not knowing much about which particular church her friend had ever attended, she simply went and knocked on the door of the next one she came across. It turned out that Faye, the organist, was still in the sanctuary alone, practicing for an upcoming concert. And Cower, having never heard organ music before, was absolutely entranced by the music. So she asked the organist if she could stay and listen, and the organist, whose name was Faye, kindly said yes. Afterwards, Cower tearfully told the woman that she could not believe that there could be a God who would send her to hell. And the organist replied that she could not imagine such a God either. And they embraced. Faye had said with her music and her embrace, "You are not a stranger to me. You are a part of me I do not yet know. Sit down and tell me who you are." Cower entered Stanford University as a student in the fall of 2001, where she planned on studying philosophy, religion, and international relations with the hope of becoming a religious professor as a career. Then 9/11 happened. Suddenly, every channel carried images of Osama. Brown skin, beard, turban. Our nation's new enemy looked just like her family. On television, President Bush declared that we were a nation united in grief and resolve. But over email and on the phone, Cower learned that her family and friends were under attack in Phoenix. Balbir, a family friend she called Uncle, was killed in a drive-by shooting while planting flowers in front of his gas station. The shooter later called himself a patriot. That morning he had boasted in a sports bar that he was, quote, going out to shoot some towel heads and we should kill their children too, end quote. Balbir was the first of 19 Sikhs who were killed in hate crimes shortly after 9/11. Cower had previously had a proposal accepted by Stanford to collect oral histories in India from Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus who had survived the massacres of the 1947 partition of India, but it was canceled as too dangerous after 9/11. So instead, Cower proposed to travel America with a videographer and document the hate crimes against the Sikh community spawned by the 9/11 attack. She says, "We caught the stories like shards of a mirror, each reflecting a fragment of the truth." Some examples. At Ground Zero, a Sikh who worked 3 blocks away from the Twin Towers came outside to see what was happening just in time to see the second plane go into the South Tower. Pieces of bodies started falling around him, and he started to run. He saw a bloodied woman crawling along the sidewalk, picked her up, and helped her to shelter under some scaffolding. Then, men on the street yelled, "You terrorist, take that effing turban." And for the second time in 15 minutes, he ran for his life. Another Sikh, a doctor, was one of the first medical people at Ground Zero. He set up a triage center and found the first survivor of the building's collapse, a policeman who was confused and dehydrated. He worked non-stop for 3 days before sleeping. When he tried to go home, he was accosted as a terrorist, and from then on, he never left his apartment alone, despite having been named by Newsweek as one of the heroes of 9/11. On September 12th, a Sikh left Boston on a train headed for Washington, D.C. When it stopped in Providence, dozens of police pulled him off the train at gunpoint. He was arrested by an anonymous tip that he looked suspicious. Broadcasts on network news that night announced that America had caught its first terrorist. No correction was broadcast by any outlet when he was subsequently released. In Sacramento, a Sikh house of worship became the first in the country to be vandalized. Kaur's Gurdwara, the name for the building where Sikhs worship, in Fresno was graffitied with the words, "This is not your country," sprayed on the walls, despite the fact that her family had lived in the United States for a century at this point. Half of the Muslim children and 7 out of 10 turbaned Sikh boys reported being bullied in school. Kaur came to understand over time that recording the stories was actually secondary to her real work, the act of grieving together. The wisdom across faith communities is that grieving is to be done in community. Grieving together, bearing the unbearable, is an act of transformation. It brings survivors into the healing process and creates new relationships. And when injustice has led to the grief, it helps energize the demand for justice. It's one way we can build solidarity, the kind that shows us the world we want to live in and our role in fighting for it. Jim has frequently reminded us that Christianity is to be practiced in community. He frequently says, "It is a team sport, folks." Kaur goes on to describe the many experiences over the rest of her college career, including protests, teach-ins, and other forms of activism. But the futility of those experiences led her to realize that merely documenting injustice was not enough to stop the killing. She came to realize that any act to change the world around us begins within us. So she decided to learn about nonviolent strategies, how to stay calm when confronted by police, advice to have non-protesting people documenting protests, how to approach the media, legal standards for protesting, and the like. She also came to understand that the norms and institutions that order the world are not inevitable, but constructed, and therefore they can be changed. The Sikh tradition calls for its adherents to be warrior sages, warriors who will defend all who need help. And by the way, there are guesstimates that Sikhs around the world are some 25 to 28 million adherents, but Sikhs have never had political control of any state, any place. They do not seek to convert people to Sikhism because they believe in the end, if we are worshiping the true God, we are all worshiping the same God, just using different language and traditions in which to do that. So although they're warriors, they are not like the Christian Templars who set out in the Crusades, for example, to liberate Jerusalem. And they are also called to be sages as well as warriors. So what would it mean to be a warrior sage in our time? Or, for that matter, a Christian committed to building up God's kingdom right here and now on earth, starting today. Think about what breaks your heart. Notice what it feels like to want to fight back. Then think about how you can channel this into something that delivers life instead of death. The warrior sage concept can be useful as a means of tapping into our bravery. Nonviolence is often considered to be passive and soft, but warrior metaphors show nonviolent action for what it is, something fierce, strategic, demanding, and very, very disciplined. Cower asks us to ask ourselves 4 questions. What can you use to fight on behalf of others? Your pen, your voice, your art, your pocketbook, your presence, perhaps? What can you use to protect yourself? Your camera, legal counsel, a group of allies, public witness? Practices center you. Use them regularly. And who is your sacred community? She says you need 3 kinds of people. One who sees the best in you, one who is willing to fight by your side, and one who can fight for you when you need help. Bring them together, she says, and you have created a pocket of revolutionary love. So, already today, you've seen some of the tools to start loving a larger group of people by choosing to see no strangers, but only people who are a part of yourself that you do not yet know. One of the amazing things about this book is that the memoir part of it, which just continues through it, is just chock full of stories and incidents and examples, so that it may look, sitting over there on the table, like a fairly heavy tome. The last quarter of it is a massive appendix, including translations into English of the songs that make up the Sikh liturgy and other concrete suggestions for learning to practice the revolutionary love she is talking about. So it's not as difficult a read as you might expect if you're just looking at the size of the book. And by the way, 2 weeks ago, it came out in paperback. So if at any point during this coming month you are tempted to get a copy to explore yourself, you can now do so in paperback. And that's the end of what I'm going to say today, but if any of you have questions or comments, this is your turn. Yeah.
Do you know where the Sikh community is most prominent in the world? For example, is Afghanistan. Do they have many Sikhs? You know?
They have some. I would say the majority of the community is still in India, which is where it first arose. But I did just recently see that a Sikh practicing medicine on the edge of Pakistan had been murdered by Taliban intruders. So I think that they are probably spread, out. Greatest community is around India. But there are several now significant Sikh communities. One's in California, of course, because it was, for many Sikhs emigrating over the years, the part of America where they would actually enter the country. There was a fairly large Sikh community in Wisconsin that we'll talk about in week 3. And of course, you may remember earlier this spring, there were 9 Sikhs, I believe, killed in Indianapolis by an aggrieved fellow worker. So there are Sikh communities sort of scattered around the country.
There's a Sikh temple in Richfield.
Ah, okay, so obviously we have some here in Cleveland. All right, if not, yes, Cindy?
Well, I was just thinking it's certainly a challenge to follow her recommendations. It's a good way to think and approach.
And one of the things, if I can be a bit confessional, since we still have 6 minutes before I can promise to let you go, and I will, because my own theological orientation is something called process theology, which focuses not so much on God's transcendence and how far away and how different from us God is, but on how closely and intimately God is woven by God's choice into each second of every life, of every cell in our bodies. And one of the consequences of believing that is that in any one of our actions remains in God's eternal and unfailing memory forever. So I'm here to tell you, regretfully but honestly, that it is fully within my capabilities to answer with a, I hope, skewering retort when someone has done something that has angered me. And as most of us do, growing up, I put some time and effort into polishing. And so I would have an assortment of skewers available for when I needed one. But the longer I thought about my theological conviction, I learned through practice that I could stop myself if I said to myself, is this the very best that you can offer to God's eternal experience if you go ahead and say this? And of course, the answer is always very shamefacedly, no. It would really feel good, but no. I cannot pretend even to myself that this is my best. And I can tell you, having practiced that now over 50 years, that it becomes much easier to do with practice. And so any one of the things that she suggests, trying to choose to wonder about the person who is now a stranger, but is in fact a part of you that you haven't met yet, can become a habit. It does take the effort to do it, but that's what she means when she says revolutionary love can be modeled, taught, and practiced. Well, thank you very much for coming.